My Govanen, welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and in my previous video I talked about how the difference in how the movie and the book handle Gandalf's disappearance due to his capture by Saruman is largely due to the needs of the medium. In the book, of course, the version works perfectly fine, but in the movie it doesn't work as well because in movies you need to keep the pace going and you don't want to have to stop and catch everybody else up on something that's happened. Here, interestingly enough, one of my viewers commented, and I forgot to get this person's permission to give their name or whatever, but if if you're watching this, you know who you are, so I appreciate the idea for the topic, and I thank them already for the topic idea, or I mentioned that I might do a video on it anyway, in my response to their comment. But the idea here is that this viewer mentioned that the significant difference of the medium doesn't necessarily justify the same kind of treatment with another scene or set of scenes, we might say, namely the whole issue of Aragorn going through the paths of the dead. And this is a very similar kind of thing to Gandalf's disappearance in one way, because the setup is basically kind of the same thing. In the book, characters go off screen for an unknown period of time, or at least from the outset we don't know how long it's going to be, and we know what they're planning to do, and we know that they're planning to show back up, but we don't know what happens to them in the meantime, and could be dead, could be who knows what, we don't know. And then in the book, of course, they show back up in a kind of spectacular way, actually, which is a little bit different than the Gandalf scenario. But in the movie, it's handled very much the same way as the movie handles Gandalf's disappearance. We actually see them sporadically in their trip, and we know kind of what's going on. And the big difference here is, well, I'll get to that. But first, let's set it up. So the first thing, of course, as I mentioned, the two scenarios are very similar. In my video on Gandalf's disappearance, I talked about how Gandalf in the book says, I'm going to go out beyond the borders of the Shire, I need to get some news. And so we have this setup of he's going, but he's going to be back. And he gives Frodo a return date. He says, I'll be back no later than your birthday. And he doesn't show up, which is a problem. Here, of course, with Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli, we don't have a specific return date. What we do have is Aragorn saying, I've got to take the paths of the dead because it's the absolute quickest way, and it's the only way quick enough to get me where I need to be to do what I need to do and save Gondor. And everybody's like, yeah, but you're gonna die. You're never gonna get out of there. You're never gonna get through the paths of the dead. That's not gonna work. And he's basically bound and determined to do it anyway. So there's no hard return date for Aragorn, unlike with Gandalf, but the scenario is kind of the same. He's basically saying, I have to go do something that takes me out of the action for a bit, at least the action that we see or read on the page, and then we don't see him again until he shows up. Now, the showing up at the very end is very different than Gandalf showing up in one sense, because Gandalf, when he shows up, is not showing up in spectacular fashion. He's just sitting there next to Frodo's bed, and he's a voice that Frodo recognizes as Gandalf saying it's 10 o'clock in the morning on October the 24th, and you're in the House of Elrond. And to Frodo, of course, this is a wonderful and unexpected surprise, although it's not entirely a surprise, because as I talked about in that video, Aragorn had already hinted that the fact that there's a stone with the G rune and three notches on it means Gandalf was probably at Weathertop on October 3rd. By the way, quick side note, if you hear a bunch of screaming in the background, my kids are playing a funny game outside, so that's, if you're hearing that, then I apologize, but such is life when your weekend gets taken up by a lot of other things. This weekend's been weird. Anyway, point being, back to the show, Aragorn basically says Gandalf was probably at Weathertop on October 3rd. And after that, of course, we pretty much know that the Black Riders must have been chasing him, so we still don't know if he's alive, and we don't even know for sure if Aragorn is right. But it's not a total shock when he shows up. Neither is it a total shock when Aragorn shows up in the book. But in the book, when Aragorn does show up, it is at least a much more showy type of thing that happens. Because in the book, when Aragorn shows up, Éomer has just, witnessed his king and uncle die. He's about to get ready to, have a suicidal charge, basically trying one last ditch effort to, hold off the enemy as much as possible. He sees the Corsair ships coming up the Anduin River, and he's thinking, okay, well, everything's going downhill. We're going to go out in a blaze of glory. He speaks some poetic lines which sound really epic, and he lifts up his sword as if in defiance of the ships, and then the standard of Aragorn is raised on the ship, and instead of being defiant, he now throws his sword up and catches it because he's so happy, because he realizes Aragorn has returned. He's made it. He did what he said he was going to do, and he didn't die in the Paths of the Dead. And so everybody is taken by surprise. The enemies are all taken by surprise, and that kind of causes them to be routed. Aragorn, brings up a bunch of fresh reinforcements from, the southern parts of Gondor, and the allies that the bad guys thought were coming to help them turn out to be their enemies, and so everything turns around in a rather dramatic shift. Much more dramatic than Gandalf being there on, at Frodo's bedside, right? Why then is it so different just because of, this one little change, right? So the main reason it's different is because ultimately the reason we get the payoff in the book is because we don't know what's happened to Aragorn. All we know is that Aragorn went south to try to find, to stop the Corsair ships from doing their damage. We didn't necessarily expect him to take over the ships. Now again, like Gandalf, this is not completely a surprise. Anybody who's reading The Lord of the Rings by this point probably has a pretty good idea that Aragorn is probably going to make it, he's probably going to succeed, and therefore doom is not inevitable, and therefore the Corsair ships probably aren't going to make it and totally crush, the last resistance of Minas Tirith. But it is still a surprise. It's not like it, it comes out of, they come out of the, south and they see the sails and they're all like, oh, you know what? That might be Aragorn. Let's wait and see. No, they're all devastated. All the good guys are kind of crushed. They're hoping that, they can get back in the walls before the Corsairs get off and kill them all. But what actually happens, of course, is that the standard raises and Éomer does what he does and everybody's happy again. Except the bad guys, of course. But the key point here is that payoff. You can't get that payoff the way Peter Jackson does it in the movie. In the movie, of course, Peter Jackson is showing us what's going on kind of the whole time. He's skipping back and forth. He shows Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli going through the Paths of the Dead, so we know that they make it, where they meet the King of the Dead, and they even get through the Paths of the Dead, and, all the stuff happens. We even see the ghosts of, the dead men of Dunharrow wipe out, the Corsair ships. So by the time Aragorn shows up, the only real interesting aspect of that is the fact that Aragorn has shown up in time to save the good guys. And then we have this one orc who's, waiting for him at the docks or whatever, and says, it's about time you got here. And then Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli jump out, and it's like, okay, so the orc is taken by surprise, and then he's not worried, and then the ghosts come out, and then suddenly he is worried. It kind of gets a little bit comical. And, there's nothing wrong with introducing a little bit of comedy every now and then, but sometimes it's not necessarily the most appropriate. This event is supposed to be a really key event in the whole War of the Ring, because this turns the tide in a major way, and the way that Tolkien describes it, and the way that the story happens around it is such that it is a huge, epic moment. It's like the arrival of the Rohirrim, when the people in Minas Tirith all think hope is lost, and then the Rohirrim arrive just in time to kind of scare off the Witch King when he's riding in the gates, and Gandalf is about to, maybe engage in, a combat that could end in his death. And then the Rohirrim arrive, and everything kind of turns around, and then things go back to being bad, and then it turns around again for the last time. This is not a moment to cheapen with silly humor. It just isn't. But that's not really the point of my video. The really interesting thing about this is the way that the book sets this up, because yes, we know that Aragorn is planning to go through the Paths of the Dead, eventually make it to the south of Gondor, stop the Corsair ships, hopefully, and then come back to Minas Tirith or something. We don't know his exact plan down to the last detail, but it's something like that. It's at least to prevent the Corsairs from doing enough damage in the south that the recruits in the south can come up to Minas Tirith and help the defense. Well, so the setup for this begins almost as soon as they end up leaving for the Paths of the Dead, because Theoden and other people are basically trying to tell them nobody makes it through there alive. Like, it just doesn't happen. Everybody's afraid of it, deathly afraid of it. We get to this point where they go into the Paths of the Dead, and Gimli can't even get himself to enter. And this is another point where book and movie differ in terms of how they handle it in terms of the humor, because in the movie, Jackson has Gimli basically, say the line, which actually is from the book, which is, this is a thing unheard of. An elf will go underground when a dwarf dare not. And in the movie, he adds on this whole, I'll never hear the end of it. And of course, it's just like he's berating himself, and then he goes in. It's like, it's kind of a silly moment, and it really shouldn't be, because in the book, what happens here is everybody's terrified. It's not just Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli. He's also got a company of rangers with him, and every single one of them is like, this is creepy. And Halbarad, who is Aragorn's cousin or something, I forget his exact relationship, but he says, this is an evil door, and my death lies beyond it, but I'm going to go anyway. And there's remarks, too, about, somebody mentions the fact that the horses aren't going to go in there. And Aragorn says, well, they've got to, because we've got to have them to make enough progress. And so there's all these little things that add up to say, this is a really spooky place. It is just terrifying. Now, we do get, both in the book and in the movie, some of the experience within the Paths of the Dead. But it's, again, very different. In the book, we get people following in torchlight, and Gimli has this growing sense of dread. He's just like increasing fear, and it talks about how Aragorn is, his willpower is what's holding everybody together, and that's the only reason they make it through. And it even says, like, only the people who were with him could have made it through there because of their, love for Aragorn and because of how tough they all are themselves. All these things keep building up. But in the movie, of course, we get these silly scenes with Gimli, seeing these little smoke hands come out of the mist, and he's like, it just kills the real sense of fear and dread that ought to be here. And that sense of fear and dread is the thing that makes it really unclear what's going to happen. Granted, we do in the book get through the Paths of the Dead, although there's no encounter with, like, a king, like in the movie. Aragorn calls out to the dead and says, come follow me. I am the heir of Isildur. I will release you from your oath. And we get a reference to the fact that they got out of the Paths of the Dead, and then they had to ride as hard as they could to make it. That's where we leave them in the book, and then we do have to catch up with them later. You could have done all of this very similarly in the movie, and it would have worked just fine, because then the only thing you really have to catch up on is the last few things that happen in the book version of the story, which is they make it out of the Paths of the Dead. That's where it cuts off. After that, they ride as hard as they can to the whole, the mouths of the Anduin and all of that region where the Corsairs are about to show up. And they're trying to get recruits as they go, but like nobody wants to join up with them because everybody's afraid of the dead men. But they get there, they have their battle with the Corsairs, and the Corsairs basically end up retreating back to the ships because they're afraid of the ghosts, but they don't totally just give up either. They still put up a fight when they're, backs to the wall, basically. So they get the ships finally. They actually win that fight. And then Aragorn releases the dead men from their oath, and then he brings the recruits from Gondor up, the Anduin, and then, of course, we get him at the very docks of, the quay or whatever, quay, whatever, of Minas Tirith up there, and they end up having those recruits fight the rest of the battle instead of just having the dead men wipe out all of Mordor's armies, which is a little cheap, but, for purposes of the movie, I can see why they kind of just shortchanged all that stuff. But there's not a whole lot there to catch up on. at that point. Once we see Aragorn get through the Paths of the Dead and then finally make it through, that does a lot of the storytelling, and then the rest of it is something that Gimli and Legolas could catch the hobbits up on pretty quickly, actually. You wouldn't have to catch them up on, the actual experience of the Paths of the Dead as much, because, we kind of had that. You could do that part. But the way they do it in the movie, again, just kind of kills a lot of the tension. So the tension not only gets killed within the Paths of the Dead, but then there's the cutoff point where we leave Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli, and at that point it's like, well, what happened? Did they make it in time? Did they not? We don't know. And then they get all the way up to the Anduin, and there's like no wind until the last day. And there's, the wind comes and it rolls back the clouds that Sauron has been pumping out of Mount Doom, which, is the first big blow against Sauron. And, of course, the Rohirrim charge at the same moment, which is a big deal. But that same wind brings the Corsairs up, which at first seems like a bad thing, but it turns out to be a good thing because of who's actually on the ships. But it's that fact that we don't know anything about what happens at that point. We don't know anything past, where he calls on the dead to follow him. We just leave it, and we don't know if he succeeds or not. And so when it finally comes up, we see the Corsair ships come up, and the people in Minas Tirith are all devastated. They're like, oh, well, it's all over. Wall up. Hope we can last a while. And then he raises the standard. Tension is released. The whole thing becomes a big, turnaround for the good guys. And this turnaround is, of course, a very providential turnaround, too, because, the wind is, I don't know that I necessarily buy that it's Manwë, Lord of the Winds, that's doing it necessarily. I think that's Corey Olsen's theory. It may or may not be, it could be, but it certainly does seem providential that at this very moment, when the Rohirrim arrive, the wind blows away the clouds, and then also simultaneously helps Aragorn and his crew get up to where they need to be in time to help win the battle. And the way the whole thing is framed in the story is such that it's just a big, epic, song-worthy event. This is the kind of things that minstrels sing songs about. Minstrels don't sing songs about dwarves blowing sillily or, like a goofball at misty hands. So that it's just that whole thing where the Paths of the Dead themselves become kind of half a joke is not, it doesn't help the whole thing, first of all. In the book, it's so opposite that it's ridiculous because, again, everything about the experience that we learned from the very beginning, and then when Gimli tells about his own fear later to the hobbits, everything about it, and we get enough of it up front. And the up front is what really matters, because by the time Gimli's telling the story in retrospect, it's like, okay, we all know what happened already. It's not like there's anything hanging in the balance. We're not unsure of the outcome at this point because the outcome's already happened. But even in the upfront part, there's so many little things. Halbarad saying, my death lies beyond this door. And, the horses won't go in. And only Aragorn's will is holding all these people together. And all this stuff. And then we get Legolas's description even of the dead following them. There's just so many things about all of this that we get that show how terrifying the experience is, and how, we see that even the skeleton of who, probably Baldur or whoever it was that was tried to get into, very rashly vowed that he would go into the Paths of the Dead and didn't make it back in the early days of Rohan. And he tried to get in and it didn't work out, and presumably that's his skeleton that they find. And so that right there also sets you off to, they could die at any moment or be scared literally half to death. We don't even know what happened to him for sure, but whatever it was not pretty. So all of this builds up to this whole thing of the whole experience being frightening, not just in terms of, ooh, spooky ghosts, but uncertain outcome. We don't know if we're going to make it alive through the Paths of the Dead. He didn't. Why would we? The only real reason, of course, being the message that was brought to Aragorn about using the Paths of the Dead because he's the because he's the heir of Isildur. That's all we have to go on. That's it. And that, that's plenty enough for the reader to be assured that he'll probably make it. But again, we still don't know how everything's going to turn out. It could be that the Corsairs make it up and then Aragorn comes along later. But that raising of the standard and the sudden realization by Éomer that, oh my gosh, that's Aragorn, and we're all okay now. It's still a lot of hard work to do because they don't have the actual army of the dead men to basically just clean out everything in almost instant fashion like in the movie, which again kind of cheapens the moment a little bit. It's not the same thing. We don't get that same sense of, we're fighting and we're holding them back and everything's going kind of okay, and then the sudden realization that, oh man, the Corsair ships made it here and all our hard work is in vain, we're all going to die. And then it turns around just like that. That moment is huge, and the way that he writes it in the book is huge. It's something that ought to have been done in the same style and with the same, effect that the Charge of the Rohirrim had just a little while earlier in the movie. The Charge of the Rohirrim and this other event are two kind of benchmark events in this battle that are so important, and they're supposed to be kind of similar in terms of their effect. The arrival of the Rohirrim is the first, oh man, we got a chance. And then when Aragorn raises his standard, it's the second, oh yeah, now we got it. That's the whole thing. And instead of having that second one, maybe, the ideal was, well, we've already had our one big moment, we don't need two in a movie. But I think it was worth having the two because it gives it all that much more poignancy when you realize the first rescue wasn't enough. And this is something that Theoden predicted, right? Even in the movie, he says, we don't have enough to defeat the forces of Mordor, but we will meet them in battle all the same. And then they do go, and they don't have enough to defeat the forces of Mordor, but they end up making it because Aragorn shows up. And so, yes, the Charge of the Rohirrim is kind of the first rescue, but it's not sufficient. And we know that in both mediums. We know that in the book, and we know that in the movie, kind of going into it. And so that second reveal, it really is important, and it really did need to be there. And so, unlike the Gandalf scenario, where it makes sense because the cost of having to go back and explain everything that happened was really high, but we could still get most of the same payoff because we still don't know that Gandalf is going to be there. It works out. I mean, it's a change that makes sense given the adaptation and the needs of the medium. Here, it doesn't really make as much sense because when Aragorn does show up in the book, that huge moment is it's a huge deal for all the characters involved in it. It's got that really cathartic, impact on the reader, and it's also got the whole Aragorn meets Éomer in the thick of battle, like Aragorn predicted earlier. There's all these things that happen in the book that don't really even get set up in the movie because they kind of skip all that stuff. But even without that, it's still the case that second major event is such a powerful one that it should have been allowed to have its power. We don't lose that much if we have to go back and explain how did you get here? Because again, once the battle is over, we could get just a really brief scene where Legolas and Gimli are talking to Merry and Pippin, and they could ask, how'd you get here? And especially Merry, because Merry's the one who actually knows where they went and all that stuff. And Merry could ask this question, and then Legolas or Gimli or whoever could explain very briefly, well, we made it through the Paths of the Dead. It was really scary, and of course, movie-wise, we already know that because we could have already seen those scenes. And then when we left the Paths of the Dead, we had to hurry to the mouths of the Anduin to catch the Corsairs before they sailed upriver, and we rescued, we did whatever we had to do, and, it wouldn't take that long to tell. Whereas telling about Saruman's capture of Gandalf would actually take some time and some explanation, because now you have to explain, like, why would he do this? You have to explain his motivations, why, you know, what he's doing. You have to explain all this stuff. Like, what is Saruman up to? He's, you know, breeding orcs. He's tearing down trees. He's building an army. And he's apparently doing it in service of Sauron. And now he's a traitor and all this stuff. You can't tell that in like 3 sentences. It's just, the information is too important for that. But here you could. You could totally cover what you need to cover in just a handful of sentences, and you don't have to bog down the story. So the cost compared to the Gandalf thing is really, really low. But the payoff that we didn't get is so high. And the fact that we didn't get it means that we missed out on a major epic moment. Like, the moment when Aragorn jumps off the ship is just not the same as Éomer, you know, looking at the Corsair ships, raising his sword like he's defying them, and then suddenly realizing, because he sees the flag, oh, wait, this is not what I thought it was, and it's great. You know, that moment is so much more impactful than the way it was handled in the movie. And, you know, the movie also basically tells us this is about to happen anyway, so it loses even what impact it could have had. Because when those Corsair ships come up in the movie, we already know who's on them. We already know what happened. There's no shock when Aragorn jumps off, and the only thing we get out of it is just, like, the mild humor of the orc being like, oh, that's not who I was expecting, and then being afraid of the ghosts, and then Legolas and Gimli, you know, Gimli saying, there's plenty for the both of us. May the best dwarf win. You know, it's just like, it's funny. It's not like horrible or anything, but it's just not anywhere near that really powerful moment that the Charge of the Rohirrim was, which it should have been. So, thank you, viewer, for suggesting this as a counter-example to how adaptations can be done right and change things that need to be changed. This is a great example on the other side of that, where the adaptation went too far and did things that it did not need to do and took away something that we really would have liked to have had. So it's a useful counterexample, and I'm glad the person brought it up, because I had not thought of it independently, but when he mentioned it, I was like, yeah, actually, that's like a perfect flip side of this whole thing. So it's actually a great follow-up video. So I hope you enjoyed that look at basically the opposite of what I did last week. If you did enjoy it, please do give the video a thumbs up, share it around. Make sure you subscribe to catch all my future content. If you're on YouTube, click the bell icon so you don't miss any notifications. Follow me on the platform formerly known as Twitter for occasional Tolkien-related trivia questions, or any of my other social links, including Discord. And you can also find support links, as well as all that, in my description below. Until the next time, I am the Tolkien Geek, signing out for the Tolkien Lore Channel. Namarie. Thanks to all my channel supporters, especially elf friends Paul Leone, Nathan Dufour, and Robert Kendling.